So hello, today I'm at St Peter and St Paul Church in Bardfield Sailing in Essex, and I'd like to talk to you about the history of the church and the village itself. So Bardfield Sailing is a village in Essex. It's 3 miles from Great Bardfield and 2 miles from Great Sailing. The village is surrounded by Essex farmland and twisty lanes. The elevation here is 84 metres or 275 feet in old money. Today's population is around 200. Now, Bardfield Sailing's name is an interesting one. Bardfield meant riverbank farmland and sailing meant dwellers by the willow. Today is an absolute glorious spring day and we waited a long time for this sort of weather. So I'm guessing a lot of people have been making the most of it today. Now, in the time of the Saxons, Bardfield Sailing was in the possession of 2 servants and 1 thane called Witgar Alfricsson. Now, Witgar's father was connected to the last Danish Saxon court of England and would build the Church of Clare in Suffolk. Now, the manor here was vast. In fact, on all my travels so far, I would say one of the biggest. It would have had 20 villagers, 22 smallholders and 8 slaves, and it'd be a sign of great wealth. Now, the manor was also made up of 13 plough teams with 28 oxen, 60 pigs and 100 sheep. But in the woodland there would be 800 pigs around here. It's a staggering manor. Now in 1066 Bardfield Sailing would be merged with Great Bardfield in the north, and we know that from 1086 Richard Fitzgilbert was both Lord and Tenant-in-Chief here. Richard himself fought at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. His father was a guardian to William the Conqueror himself and was rewarded with an incredible 167 manors across England. Now, Richard's descendants would carry the name de Clare and become one of the greatest baronial houses in the Middle Ages. Richard's youngest son Robert would give the rise to the Barons of Fitzwalter. Now, during the medieval times, this village was divided into 2 manors, Wymers and Westdales or Waistdales. Now, Wymers was named after Robert Wymer of 1329, and it would be sold to Guy's Hospital of London in 1729. Now, Westdales Manor was named after William de Westdale of 1329, and we have a Gilbertus who was described as a great lord of Westels, who legendary accompanied Richard the Lionheart to the Holy Land. Look at this creation, this carving that's been made, I guess, out of a redundant tree. Isn't it fantastic? Like something out of Lord of the Rings. Bardfield sailing had its own church before 1349. The ancient Mortimer family and the Augustinian monks of Clare Priory were behind its construction. Now in 1380 this church would be dedicated to, or dedicated as, St Peter and St Paul, and it's likely that this was a memorial and dedication to Edmund Mortimer, the 3rd Earl of March, who was patron of Clare's Priory. And here is today's church of St Peter St Paul. Now in 1380 England was at war with France in the 100 Years' War. The country had suffered decades of plague and there simply weren't enough people to work the lands. Trouble was afoot. Now in 1381 the Bishop of Pisa, Italy, would consecrate this church land, and I dare say bless the very tower we see before us. Conflict with Great Bardfield. Now Bishop Braybrooke of 1384 discovered that a serious dispute had existed between the inhabitants of Bardfield Sailing and Great Bardfield. The small chapel here had received its own dedication and free burials for the locals, and in return owed obligations to the mother church at Great Bardfield. The parishioners here pointed out that it was way over a mile walk to Great Bardfield's church, especially in winter, as you can imagine. And it would take a further 190 years before this chapel would finally become a church in 1574. And we can thank William Beldoves for that. For St Peter and St Paul's Church could now conduct services and administer sacraments and the rites of the Holy Church. Now before we move forward, I'd just like to point out this amazing old gate. For this old gate post, I'm guessing, I might be surmising here, but the way it's all curved, it could well be from a ship. You never know. Often when the ships were broken up, the ship's timbers were used in churches. St Margaret the Virgin Shrine. Now it is believed that way before this church was even built, a shrine stood perhaps on the side of the road, not far from the gate, and it would be dedicated to St Margaret of Antioch. Now Margaret was born in Antioch in today's Turkey. Her father was a pagan priest. Her mother died and Margaret was raised by a Christian woman. Now Margaret would embrace Christianity, her father would disown her. Now a Roman governor demanded that she marry him and denounce Christianity, but Margaret refused. She was tortured and miraculous incidents occurred. Many witnesses would actually convert and Margaret would be beheaded. Now St Margaret would become a popular cult and shrine during the medieval period, becoming the patron saint of expectant mothers, pregnancy, and I also read that pilgrims would approach her shrine on their knees. And they would hope for a healthy pregnancy or birth. Today there are 250 churches that bear her name, St Margaret. Now the location of the shrine was actually right here. Originally the shrine would have been here and there would have been two doors, and we'll see the actual stonework from the original shrine when we go inside. The witch trials of Essex. Bardfield sailing, like many in Essex village, would suffer terribly from the Essex witch trials. To give you an example, there would be 760 trials and executions of both men and women accused of witchcraft, which became a capital punishment from 1542. Now in 1575 this village was called Little Sailing, and John and Marjorie Kirkham would be tried. Then we have Great Sailing, which I could find no trials of, but Stebbing, not so far, had 10 names. There was a woman called Albury Pond of Old Sailing, and she would be tried and convicted of bewitching a horse and a man in 1602, and on the 2nd of January of that year she would meet her end. Now I found an interesting story from 1854. A family here called the Morels would leave this small village and would emigrate to Australia. Now Thomas Morel and his family would board one of the 90 ships that landed on Australia's coast, and Bardfield Sailing Parish would fund the Morels' passage for the family. It would cost £29 in 1854. Now we shall have a look at this lovely old church. So now we are facing St Peter St Paul Church, which is most ancient, built sometime before 1349 by the Mortimer family and the monks of Clare Priory. We're now looking at the north and the west tower, but if we look here we've got a Millennium Yew, which as the name suggested are planted in the year 2000 to bring in a new millennium. Now we can clearly see the west tower is circular, and it's one of only 6 in Essex, so making it incredibly rare. Now the walls of the church are built of flint rubble from these very fields. The dressings are of oolite and clunch. Now we shall have a look closely at the oolite stones. So as you approach the south porchway, if you look at the stones just on the right here, these are made of tiny seashells and sand when the sea was shallow and warm 160 million years ago. And you can see they've been formed into blocks. Now if we get in closer, we may be able to see. You can just make out the small grains of sand, perhaps shellfish. Now if we start with the West Tower, which is 11 feet in diameter. It's built in 3 stages. If we look right at the top, we can see some gargoyles. So on the parapet are 2 gargoyles watching over us. Now gargoyles are said to ward off evil spirits, and according to French legend, St. Romanus saved his country from a dragon named La Gargoyle. Now they were used in architecture from the 13th century. Rainwater runs off the roof and through the gargoyle's mouth. And here's another view of the tower. Now if we come all the way down, just look at the carvings or stone heads either side of the window. Just captured it before the weather taken it out. And like a defensive window here. To remember, this was built around 1349. So now we shall concentrate on the south porch. Now the original porch was built around 1349. You can just about make, well, you can clearly make out the shape of it there. And we can see today's porch is built in the 19th century. I suspect it was built after the old porch was removed, but I understand this church sustained a lot of damage from World War II, so it's possible it could have been touched up then. If we look at the bottom, we can see the old Victorian boot scraper. And another ancient stone here. I'm kind of curious what these blocks would have originally been from. So as we enter the old porch, now the south door is 14th century and you can see the 2 stone archwork. Now we can look at the stoop. Now, this original 14th century stoop is where you would take the holy water and make the sign of the cross before entering the church. If you look either side of the door, you'll see various sections of graffiti. For around a certain period, this church was in a bad state, and few records existed from 1715 to 1800. The church was even used as a barn. It's very likely that this graffiti was made up by the farmers. There's a really interesting date if we look up here, 1794. Now, in 1794, Lord Nelson loses his right eye at the siege of Corsica. The French Revolution is taking place. Now, if you look, it says it's got the 4th of February. Now, when this was carved, the French Convention abolishes slavery in its colonies. Now we shall go into the old church itself. So now we have entered the nave itself, which measures 58 feet by 20 feet. It was built before 1349, probably unfinished due to the Black Death. Now, if we pan around, we can get a view of the south doorway. Doesn't that make a pretty picture? Now, if we look over to the north wall, in the corner, you can just make out a small cross. So in 1380, this church was finally complete and consecrated. Here we can see an original consecration cross. This would have been blessed by a bishop. Now, typically there were 12 painted crosses in a church such as this. The bishop would sprinkle the altar and floor, the door frames and the pillars and walls with the holy water. And this marks such a blessing spot. 1380. If you look just right to the cross, you'll see the original blocked north doorway. Now I'd like to point out this small table here. This will be very important to the church. It's got the Church Restoration Fund. There's a small box there for donations. But we've also got events that are going on in this very small village. And we can see the events soon coming up to celebrate King Charles's crowning, the coronation. And also a plant sale, and you can see the proceeds go to the sailings churches. There's a group of churches that share the money. And it's well worth taking a look at this book, buying one for a couple of pounds. They're really quite interesting, goes into depth about the history of the village. It's interesting. Now we have stepped back a little bit and we're looking at the font. You can see the priest step as well. Now this is an early perpendicular font from around 1380, and each face is on an octagonal bowl, is recessed with a ogee arch. Now the rim of this font has been damaged. The lid fasteners or staples have been repaired long ago. And we can just make out the line there. Just about see it here, very well repaired. Now the Bishop of Exeter in 1287 ordered that every parish church font must have covers and be kept locked for cleanliness and to prevent superstitious purposes, i.e. the theft of the water, which was holy. So if we look around, we can see many pews. I have no information on the date. And we shall look at the arcade here. Now the south arcade has 3 bays with moulded capitals and bases. Notice the stone heads, I believe, of a king and queen. And of the king. Now we're going to look at this lovely piece of carpentry. Now we're looking at the pulpit panel. It's very unique and dated to 1625. It's an elaborate carved series of panels once formed a 2 or 3 deck high platform for the pulpit. Now, in the year 1625, Charles I becomes King of England, and the English warships intercept Spanish ships, bringing back treasure from South America. Now we're going to look at the pulpit. This pulpit is also 1625, a hexagonal pulpit with side panels and pilasters at the angles. It's really something else, isn't it? Like a three-dimensional design on it. You think this is just 5 years after the sailing of the Mayflower, 1625. I can't resist going up the steps, having a little look. You can see a small seat here. we're facing the chancel. Now this is probably one of the smallest I've been to. It measures 10 feet by 16 feet. It was built around 1380, 1 year before the Peasants' Revolt. Now originally, the other side of the east wall we're looking at, there would have been a semicircular apse. And then it fell down into disrepair in the 17th century, and it was altered in the 19th century, having two doors straight ahead of us on the east wall. And here we have a picture of what it looked like. You can see the two doors. Now, in World War II, bomb damage caused this wall to be replaced. The doors were blocked up and the outside wall was rendered. And I guess a lot of history has occurred here. Now, where we're looking now, the sedile, a 14th century sedile at that. The window has been carried down low to form a seat for the priest or his assistant to sit down on. Very unusual. Now, if we look to the right, we can see the squint, which originally was a small opening to allow worshippers to view the sacred altar. It was opened up to the floor level at an unknown date. Now, if we go back the other side of the window, we've got some Bibles. Now, these are the Barding Sailing Bibles of 1840. Now, against the north wall on the floor, we have an ancient slab, which is 15th century, which shows a lady and gentleman. So now we shall make our way to St Margaret's Chapel. So St Margaret's Chapel, or the South Wall, measures 34 feet by 9 feet, built around 1349 and finished in 1380. Now, what we look at is described in the book as the secret of the stones. Once these stones were part of the apse outside. They were first mentioned in 1424 as the shrine of St Margaret the Virgin. They would have formed an arch over St Margaret's statue. We have a picture. You can see the two doorways there. Now, how many pilgrims must have gazed up in awe at these stones? Now, the pilgrim's route actually ran from London through Bardfield sailing and on towards Walshingham Shrine in Norfolk. You can see there's a large array of stones here, and they've been labelled as well. Now, it's most probable that the shrine was smashed and broken up during the dissolution of the monasteries in 1536. I can just imagine the Victorians coming here and researching these stones themselves. You can pause this on the video if you wish to read about it. An illustration from the architect. Now there's another panel next to the stones. This is straw plating. Now, straw plating comes to Barding Sailing. From 1800, Bardfield Sailing had repaired its damaged and dilapidated church, and now a new cottage industry was changing village life. It was called straw plating. Now, straw would be dried and braided into different shapes, such as hats, the type that Van Gogh would wear, table mats, baskets, even mattresses. But very fine decorations were also crafted by the finest artisans, and they've made it here into these boards. Now, straw villages such as Bardfield Sailing, Braintree and Great Sailing would employ nearly all the women, children and old men of each village. Great Bardfield, not far from here, even has a museum which shows such works, but we have perhaps the finest and unique pieces made just here in Bardfield Sailing. Now here we have some fine examples made in the village in 1880 by Miss Dobson and her friends. I'm just thinking maybe they all had a section that they would make. Just wondering, is the craft still going? So, if you look at the first pillar in the chapel itself, and about halfway down, just above the level of the pew, you may be able to make out a very interesting piece of graffiti. It's believed to represent a Tudor bishop. And just above the bishop, you can make out another piece of graffiti. Now that, ladies and gentlemen, is what you call handwriting. Now on the same column, on the side, we have a Tudor gentleman with cloak and high crowned hat and sword. If we look down, we can see sort of costume he wore, very ballooned out. And the date above him, 1698. Okay, we're going to make our way down a little bit further. And here's the first memorial. This is a memorial to Leslie Guest of Sailing. Now, Leslie was an author, journalist, doctor and politician. He served as a battlefield doctor in the Boer War of 1899. He would stay on in Africa and practice medicine. Back in London, Leslie would establish health clinics in public schools. During World War I, Leslie served as a captain with the Royal Army Medical Corps and would receive the Military Cross for establishing a forward aid post in our advanced lines over a mile in front of his regimental aid post, by his courageous decision to remain there in spite of heavy shelling. Now in peacetime, Leslie would serve as a politician in London. Islington North was involved with the Red Cross. During World War II, he established free school meals and milk, irrespective of financial circumstances. And I can still remember receiving the milk when I was young at school. Now in 1950, he became Baron of Sailing and would serve in the House of Lords. But he is most remembered for his welfare work with children across the slums of London and abroad. Such an incredible man and an interesting life. Now we are looking what's most likely the original or part of the rood screen. It's an incredibly rare 14th century screen. Now how it survived the English Reformation, I have no idea. Now this screen was once set off to the rear of the altar, set as a reredos with the straw plating. Must have made a striking backdrop in the chancel. And if you look, the left and the right are slightly different. You can make out some of the paint. And repairs. And beneath a further panel from the pulpit, so it really was tall. Now, if you look behind the altar, just to the right of the crucifix of Jesus, there is a tiny date in graffiti which may be overlooked. Simply 1815. Now, in this year, the Duke of Wellington wins a decisive victory over Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte at the Battle of Waterloo. Perhaps one of the soldiers was here. Now, just aside of the graffiti, we have another Cecilia. Piscina. Now, yet again, this is the original 14th century piscina where the holy vessels were washed, I'm guessing during Mass. Now, next to the piscina, we have the sedilia. The window sill carries down to form a seat, which is most unusual with splays either side. Now, I'm guessing these splays are designed so the seater can put his shoulder in there, gives him more space. And to remember those that never returned and made the ultimate sacrifice. Okay, now we're going to make our way to the gallery. So as we climb these steps, we go back to around the year 1800 when this gallery was built, 223 years ago. You can see the headstops have been damaged. Okay. It's very good that this church allows you to have access because a lot of churches close these areas off. So I'm guessing these are the choir stalls. It's got some serious elevation. If I go all the way round, you can see backs onto the steps. You can see the pipework from the organ. And the organ itself is here. So we look upon this fine 18th century chamber organ restored by Cedric of Faxted. Now, once this organ was owned by Sir George Elvey, a most famous organist and composer of church music. So it's most likely that some of the music we will listen to in church was composed by Sir George himself. Now this fine organ was last hand pumped right up until 1972. Okay, we shall make our way down the steps. We shall make our way outside. Glorious sunny day. So, St Peter St Paul Church only has one bell. It was cast by Leicester and Pack Foundry in 1768 in Whitechapel, London. Now Thomas Leicester, aged 35, would move to the Whitechapel Foundry in a new premises called the Archichoke Inn on Whitechapel Road, London. Thomas would go into partnership with Thomas Pack in 1752, and they would cast America's Liberty Bell of Pennsylvania and also Westminster's Abbey tenor, and over 300 other bells including Bardfield Sailing's bell. Originally there were 3 bells here. 2 were sold to fund much needed repairs. Okay, let's have a quick walk around the church. I think there's going to be a lot of happy people today with this weather. It's a much needed tonic because we've had such a wet grey winter. I think everybody was getting quite annoyed of it. So this would have been a very important spot here where the pilgrims would have visited for the shrine. Now going on to the north side. Again we can see some headstops which have been, I think these have been damaged. I'm guessing the Reformation, they came around and destroyed a lot of stuff here. See this quite unique tower. You could just make out the gargoyle to the right. Down at the base we can see the other side of the north door. It's been blocked. I'm guessing that would be the stoop to the right that's been broken. You just imagine a soldier smashing it with a poleaxe across here. On top of the archway is something unusual, something been missing or gouged out. So St Peter St Paul Church is open daily that I can see. They carry out baptisms, weddings and funerals and are involved with the community here. So I hope you enjoyed that and thank you very much.